Hey, everybody, what we're going to talk about today is unopposed, isolated technical training. Like, it seems to be a bit of a topic where people are like, oh my God, you can't do unopposed, isolated technical training. Um, from my perspective, and again, this is just my opinion, is of course you could do unopposed, isolated technical training. It really depends on what your environment is, and it also depends on what the players need and player motivation. Like, do they want to do that? And the other type, should you be doing those things at practice? Should the kids be doing those things at home? And the debate rages on, right? And what are the benefits? Is it the most beneficial thing to do? So when I look at these things, I look at Larry Bird, right? One of the greatest shooters of all time, and one of the best basketball players of all time, period. So Larry Bird would shoot so much in his driveway as a kid. In order to make his nets, the basketball nets, last longer, he would coat the nets with Vaseline. Because if he didn't do that, he practiced so much isolated, technical, unopposed training that the nets would rip. So at that point, he figured out he could shoot longer at this. If he put Vaseline, it wouldn't rip. So long story short is he obviously got very, very proficient, and it improved his game um, by isolated, unopposed technical training. However, we look at books that came out like The Talent Code and Meaningful Touches on the Ball. And we look at deliberate practice about challenging yourself, and each repetition needs to push you to the edge of your technical ability and so forth. I'm not sure I completely agree with the meaningful touches on the ball in isolated technical training, unopposed, in a sense of, is that what you should be doing in team training? Again, this is another debate that if you are in an environment where the kids never learned how to play soccer and they don't even understand how to control or pass a ball, well, now I think that you have a good point that you can do some unopposed technical training, and it doesn't have to be all. And can you work that in then into a decision making game representative training session? Of course you can, even at the simplest level, whether it's 1v1, 2v1, whether it's whatever you want, but it doesn't all have to be isolated, unopposed training, even when the kids are just learning. However, it can be. You can definitely use it. And then I would say, even at the highest level, there's certain days and workloads, or if you want to use it for a warm up, who says you can't do that? Of course you can do that. Not every second of every practice has to be opposed, and that takes physical effort opposed. It takes mental effort opposed. Sometimes you don't want to do that. It doesn't fit what you're doing. Um, but when we talk about gaining skill, right? Well, let's not forget about environmental constraints. So if you're playing on a bumpy field, if you're playing in the sand, if you're playing futsal, all that stuff can bring about unique skill sets that you probably wouldn't have gained if you were just doing unopposed technical training on, just say, a turf field or one, whatever it is, because there's not a big range of variability there. We're starting to see that even golfers are starting to rethink. Like when I grew up, golfers would go on the golf range and just hit buckets of balls for hours and hours and hours. You're just repeating the same swing. And we know that when we talk about isolated technical training, you can never do the same motion twice. So it's actually learning how to learning how to adapt to what's going on at the moment while you're creating that repetition. So an example is, what if you just ran the basketball court and you just ran 75 feet and you beat two guys off the dribble, and now you got to take a jump shot? That's a completely different demand than if you're just going to pick up a basketball and shoot the jump shot over and over again. your body is going to handle that repetition differently. There are going to be key fundamentals in that repetition, but each repetition is going to be in itself different. Now, Ted Williams, he didn't want to correct your form in baseball, right? And when you were your baseball swing. If you were making great contact with the ball and getting hits, he didn't even mess with it. So again, then the role of street soccer, the role of playing with good players, where you can now start to um, emulate what they do. How is that, impacting your technique? Now, one of the things is the skill used frequently? It's a massive thing here. Of course, like a push pass is going to be used frequently, but I would contend that a left-footed volley, maybe a left-footed side volley, what do you hit that twice a year in training? Probably. Who knows? I mean, granted, you could make conditions in a game that are like, in order to score, it's got to be off a volley, right? But how often is that really going to happen? So there was recently a video on YouTube about Stephen Curry, and he's shooting isolated, unopposed technical training. He's shooting jump shots from the corner, and they asked him. They said, Why are you doing that? It's a big debate. Like, is isolated training really needed?" And he said he never really gets to take that shot from that area of the floor that often. So he started to really focus on taking that shot from that area of the floor. Now, what they didn't show you was, yeah, he would do a shuttle run. He would do some sort of physical activity and then take the shot. So what you didn't see was the variability that he put into it. And I'll give you an idea in soccer. Like, if you're going to practice penalty kicks, how many times you just practice penalty kicks at the end of practice? It's great in a penalty kick shootout, but let's be realistic. Most of the time you're going to do a penalty shot is right in the middle of a game. Somebody gets fouled, you got to step up and take the kick. So how about during small-sided games, during training, while you're working at full intensity? All right, penalty kick, let's do it. Now it is the same workload, the same fatigue. Then also from a psychological standpoint, are you putting something on the line? Because it's not just physical. You have to emulate the psychological, the mental impact. So when you think about isolating technical skills, I really do think that it's a good thing to practice the things that you don't get to practice a lot in training sessions on your own, for sure. So, and variability is such a huge thing in training. So when we talk about just isolated one thing after another, maybe you set up cones, maybe you want to keep it variable. The more variability, the better it is, and the more you can adapt that, because the reality is whatever you're doing to learn that skill, you eventually have to put it into a game situation, and you have to be able to adapt it. And the more you train with variability, the more chance you have to do that. So it really is about, after you know that skill, and we could talk about what rapid skill acquisition is and what is the best way to do it. But the reality is the when, the where, and the how, the cognitive part, the part about the decision making. So yes, you have to have the skill, but that's only one part. And to me, that's actually a smaller part. We could argue that, Johan Cruyff, he said he didn't develop the Cruyff turn in isolated technical training. He created the Cruyff turn on the fly during a game, using just instinctively. I would argue that if he didn't have a solid technical base, he's never instinctively developing the Cruyff turn in a game. But at the same time, again, this is nothing that he practiced. He never practiced the Cruyff turn. So this is massively important. This is why I say you have to give the kids a chance to apply that technique, and so they can answer the when, where, and how. And it's basically going to spend the whole lifetime of their career learning, These are the tactical parts, the decision-making parts. That takes forever to do. And the more technique that you have, yes, the more solutions on the ball that are available to you. If you can't do a bicycle kick and the ball is crossed, you are not even going to perceive that as a possibility. Therefore, your decision making is already cut down. So your perceived affordances, right? Affordances, your ability, your options on the ball based upon who you are, your skill level, your physical characteristics, all that, are already diminished. So I would agree that the more well-rounded technique that you have, the more options that gives you, then but you could have all the core training you want and dribble in between cones and do all this. If you never really apply this enough in game situations, game representative training, you're going to be too slow. You're going to be too slow to execute. You're not going to have the coupling of real cues in these game representative trainings. So without all that fancy talk, the reality is, yes, once you have your technique, you need to apply it in games, and you need to play a lot. That's the bottom. That's why street soccer can be so nice as well. Now, be careful about the teaching of technique in a sense. So in math, for example, like different domains don't necessarily transfer over. So if you want to talk about a great teacher, hey, this guy's such a great math teacher, and this is what he does, and this means this is how we should do it in soccer. It's not the case, because math, for example, has a correct answer. 2 plus 2 cannot equal 17. That's not the correct answer. There is a final correct answer, and there are rules to get that correct answer. In sports, there are a million ways to score a goal. There are a million decisions, more than a million decisions that can be made. And there's not one answer. And we already talked about the variability. There is no way that you are going to perform 2 repetitions the same exact way. So it's a constant realignment of what's going on. So sports is much more complicated. So I'm not going to sit here today and say, hey, this is the one way. What I can do is reflect, though, on my own experiences. I'll give you an example. Is, say, an inside of the foot where I drag the ball forward and then swivel my hips and go around the defender's foot. We'll call it an inside of the foot cap. I learned that move by constantly practicing that for hours a day for 2 days in a row, right? I didn't practice anything else but that. Once I got that, I started to apply it in the game. That took much longer to apply it in the game. But once I did, it became, we'll call it hardwired into my brain, and that right there stayed with me. And once it stays with you and you got it and you know how to use it in a game representative training and you use it enough at the right times with the right timing, the right execution, now it's part of you. And I no longer have to go back and train that. It's just with me. I can refresh it. I can become more attuned with it. I can keep doing it like maybe 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, but I didn't have to go back and spend hours. And even to this day, I can do it. So here's the lesson that I got, me personally, was if I was to take 25 different 1v1 moves and work on all 25 for 5 minutes each, I would learn none of them. But if you focus, don't make it too wide, if you focus on one and stay on that and focus on it for hours and hours and hours and days, you're going to learn that move. It's going to become part of you. Now you try to execute that in game representative trainings, in real games, small-sided, large, doesn't matter. Now you learn it. Then you go on to the next, and then the next. And there's also going to be skills that are better suited for a faster player than a slower player. Skill sets that are better suited for slower players. These things we can even talk about, do you need these? If you're a center back to know a double scissors, is that helpful? You're not pulling a double scissors in a game. in my mind it is, because you're going to know if you see that maybe from a striker coming at you, you can recognize it, and the coupling of those cues can help you in your defensive strategy, your footwork. So anyway, so at the end of this, I guess my message to you is that we do have to start to think about theory. And my last video was about theory as well. What is your belief system about skill acquisition? For me, I don't have all the answers, but what I can say, even through all my years of coaching and watching kids improve, and myself as a guinea pig of how I actually learned and became skillful. Well, maybe that's debatable if I'm skillful or not, but it's, yes, there is huge benefit to spending hours and hours and hours in isolated skill development. You could see that with the African javelin thrower who won I believe it was a gold medal in the Olympics for javelin throwing, who did not have a coach. He learned everything by YouTube videos from a coach that was in Scandinavia. And all he did was he had the motivation to train it himself watching the YouTube videos. Hours and hours and hours of training. Now, we could talk about things like, Bruce Lee, who would say, I can get more out of 3 minutes of practice than you can in 3 hours. I mean, these things are impactful, and we can, I could spend another video on exactly what Bruce Lee meant by that. But what I would say is this: depending on your environment, if your kids have never played soccer before, go for it. Isolated, unopposed, technical training, excellent. If you're dealing with a pro club and you want to do, some passing, and you want to do whatever it is, if it's the right day and you want a low mental workload and you don't want a lot of stress on their brains and you're warming them up, or you just want to get a little workload on the legs, whatever you want to do, if that's what it's for, okay, I'm not going to, that's fine. You're not teaching them anything. They're not learning anything. It's just for, that right there is just for the physical. But in general, I would say it is really, and this is my opinion, it is up to the player to put in those hours and hours and hours, because information is at their fingertips. They can learn how to do any technical skill there is in soccer from the internet. They have to be in charge of their own technical development. Yes, it helps to have a coach to guide them, to correct them, because in something like golf, you could have somebody who is awful, and they do the same incorrect technique for 10 years, and they keep hitting the ball in the woods for 10 years. I've seen it. I've worked on a golf course for 10 years. And what a little instruction from an expert coach can do wonders, right? So I'm not saying that an expert coach doesn't work, but once the expert coach gets in there, changes things up a little bit if it needs, then it's up to that player to continue to practice on their own. And that's where big, big gains are made. The next thing is that in training time, for me, that's decision-making time. That is the time to take those skills that the player has learned and let them execute those skills in a real game representative soccer environment, where now they're adding decision making to the skill sets that they've learned, to their technical skill sets. Otherwise, if they're never adapting their skill sets, they're not really learning how to play. You could be a great juggler of the soccer ball. You can have some great, you could be a trick guy and have some incredible command of the ball, but does it mean you're going to be a good player? It absolutely does not mean that. But in general, the more well-rounded skill set you have, the more affordances you have, the more options you have on the ball to solve problems, to come up with solutions on the field. And we know this, that like Platini, who would say, that when he was able to really become great was when he didn't have to look at the ball anymore. It let him lift his eyes up to solve problems on the field at super fast speeds, because he wasn't stuck on eyes down controlling the ball, because he didn't have that technical ability yet. And this goes on from Pistol Pete Maravich, who brought a basketball with him everywhere he went. He was in the movie theaters with a basketball. Now you could say, oh, that's isolated training, unopposed. Well, let's not say that Pistol Pete Maravich didn't make it to the highest level, and let's not say that wasn't part of the process, because it definitely was part of the process. And you're going to see that those types of things are relevant to some of the world's best players. How much were the world's best players with the ball? A lot. A real lot. And for players who are technically really deficient, how much time do they spend with the ball? Not a lot. And these are general things that we really need to think about. And as a coach, we need to start to take that theory and put the theory into practice.